I think my neighbor has a dark secret. I grew up in Kentucky. I was a country boy. I had fun rolling in fields and exploring backwoods. My town was nothing more than a blip on the map. My dad worked as a mechanic, and Mom worked at a general store downtown. We weren't farmers, but we had a few veggie gardens and a few chickens. Across from our old house lived Earl Shaw. Now Earl was the real deal. He was a farmer, but what he loved most was working in his garage. Inside were old trucks he was working on, ones that looked more dead than alive. He would fix them up and sell to the highest bidder. To me, that garage was magic. I used to go to Earl's place every summer. My parents were busy and I was an only child, and Earl seemed to enjoy my company. He would work on his truck while I watched. I'd listen to him mutter about engines, talking to them like they were old friends. "Hand me that wrench, Freddie," he said without looking up. His hands were always stained with grease. Which one, Earl? The big one or the little one?" I asked. I was trying to be as helpful as I could, but it still felt like I was getting in the way. "The big one, kid, and fetch me that rag while you're at it. Can't see a darn thing under here without wiping this grime off." I grabbed the rag and gave it to him, proud to be helpful. Earl slid out from under the truck before wiping his brow. Then he smiled at me. "You're a good lad, Freddie. Not afraid of a little dirt, are you?" "Nah, I like it. Makes me feel like a mechanic, like my dad," I said, puffing out my chest. Earl laughed, and he went into a story. He loved talking about the cars he worked on when he was my age. I loved his stories. They made the hours slip by like minutes, and before I knew it, the sun was setting. I had just turned 14 when I saw him polishing a 1975 Ford pickup. It was in the middle of July, and the sun reflected off the hood like a beacon. Earl greeted me with a wave of his hat. "I finally went and did it. I got myself a real beauty this time. Have a look," he said. I agreed that she was indeed the real beauty. "I'll tell you what, fella, she's the last truck I'll ever own. I'll tell you that right now," he said, hooking his thumbs in his overalls. God, I'd heard that line so many times over the years. Old people love saying that. It was like the older people got, the more comfortable they were with the idea of death. Earl and his friends usually went for a Ford or GM, but if I had my pick, I'd go with a Toyota. "What do you think?" Earl asked. It's huge. Where'd you get it?" I said. Well, that's a story for another time. Let's just say it took a sweet deal to bring her home." I hung around with Earl that afternoon, like most days. We weren't doing much, just cleaning the garage. But it felt good being there. It felt like I was a part of something important. "Ever drive one of these?" Earl asked, gesturing to the truck. "Nope. Ma says I gotta wait till I'm older," I replied, watching him work. "Well, she's right. But one day, you'll get behind the wheel or something like this, and it'll feel great. Nothing like driving a truck, feeling the road under you," he said with a nod. That truck really was special. It shined like it was straight off the showroom floor. Even the inside smelled brand new. Eventually, my mom called from across the street. She told me it was time to come home for dinner. Dinners at home were quiet. My parents didn't talk much. They were always distant, caught up in their own thoughts. I'd sit in front of the TV after dinner, watching my shows, and I would do that until it was time for bed. This was my routine every summer day. Might sound boring to some, but I really cherished those memories. That night was so hot I couldn't sleep, and then I heard a long moo sound. It was followed by a lot of noise coming from Earl's barn. Curious, I crept out of bed and looked out my window. Outside the barn doors sat the shiny new pickup. I wondered if one of the cows was having trouble giving birth. Earl had to help them along sometimes. I could see him moving around. He was carrying stuff back and forth from the truck to the barn. I squinted, trying to make out what he was carrying, but it was too dark. Sometimes, he'd pause and look around, as if he was afraid of being watched. I thought about going over there. Maybe the old man needed a hand, but I knew my parents wouldn't like it if I snuck out at night. But they didn't understand my relationship with Earl. He was like a grandpa to me, and I wanted to make sure he was okay. But I stayed put. I stayed by my window, watching. And then Earl dragged something big out of the barn. Looked heavy. With every move, I could hear a low cry coming from it. The sound carried through the air to my window. Behind it, I could see it leave a dark stain on the ground as Earl pulled it to the truck. Once he was close enough, he opened up the front and he shoved whatever it was into the truck. I saw Earl struggle to get the door shut. He pushed and shoved at it until it closed. In the barn, a cow let out a long, sad moo. Almost sounded like it was crying. It made me feel uneasy, like something wasn't right. Earl paused for a moment. He looked back at that barn as if he heard it too. Then he slammed the truck door one last time before he locked everything up. He glanced around once, like he was making sure no one was watching. Then he hurried back to his house and disappeared inside. The barn went dark, and everything was quiet again. Lying back down on my bed, I stared at the ceiling. Earl was so protective of that new truck, always polishing it. Why would he put something in it that he just dragged through the ground? It had to be something important. I turned over and I tried to get some sleep, but the image of Earl dragging that shape through the dirt, it kept playing in my mind. I went straight to Earl's place the next morning. I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling from last night. I found him in the barn, tending to his cows. But the air was thick with a smell I recognized. A cow had just given birth. I'd helped Earl enough times with the calving to know that scent. Earl, smells like you had a birth last night. Everything go okay? I said.
Oh, yeah. Lola had a calf last night. Didn't make it though. Tough birth, you know.
He replied. But before I could say anything more, Earl quickly changed the subject.
Hey, listen, Freddie, I need to head into town for some supplies. It's best if you head on home now, okay?
I nodded, a bit confused by the rush to send me away. Okay, yeah, Earl, I'll see you later, okay? I said, but he'd already turned to head back inside. I lingered for a moment, watching as he climbed into the truck. It was spotless, shining under the morning sun. And this next part, I swear I actually saw it. The front wheels turned towards me, and a yellow liquid leaked out of the headlights. I spent the rest of that day biking around the neighborhood, trying to distract myself. Sand Field was a small place. It had just one main street, and most people lived out on the farms. There wasn't much to do for a kid like me, so I stopped by the diner for some ice cream before finally heading home. I heard the sound of hooves as I pedaled down the road. I looked back and my stomach dropped. It was Lester Andrews riding his horse on the other side of the street. He was always on that damn horse of his. A big, mean stallion that would try to bite you if you got too close. I pedaled away faster, hoping he didn't see me. Lester was a big deal in town. He was a star football player. Everyone knew he would get a full ride to college because he was so damn talented. But when nobody was looking, Lester was a different person. He bullied me and roughed me up. Nobody ever believed that when I tried to tell him. They all thought Lester was too good to do something like that. All in all, Lester Andrews made my life a living hell. Dinner came and went, and I hardly remembered eating. That night was another hot one. I was sweating just from laying down, and that's when I heard noises coming from Earl's barn again. It was late, the kind of hour when the world should have been silent. I crept to the window, and I peered out across the road. The moon was high and bright, casting long shadows across the ground. It made the tin roof of Earl's barn glow. The noises from Earl's barn got louder, and the cows started freaking out. They were mooing like they were scared or hurt. Suddenly, all the mooing stopped. It was like someone hit the mute button on the TV. Then, I heard heavy thwacking sounds that kept going for a long time. I squinted in the dark, and I tried to figure out what was happening. That's when I saw Earl dragging something out of the barn. Even with a weak moonlight, I could tell it was a freshly butchered leg of a cow. He hauled it into the cab of his pickup truck. Then, he disappeared back into the barn. I couldn't look away. I was stuck there watching him as he kept coming out, each time with another part of a cow. He dumped all of it into the back of the truck, and every time, the truck revved its engine. I was glued to the window, watching every single move Earl made. I figured I needed to do something about what I was seeing, so I set up a camera pointed right at the farm. I wanted to make sure I caught everything, but I kept nodding off, no matter how hard I tried to stay awake. Sure enough, I did fall asleep. I rushed to check the camera as soon as I woke up. The footage was grainy, all shades of green from the night vision mode. It was hard to make out the details. Through the fuzziness, I saw that Earl was busy until dawn. He just kept loading the cab of his truck with butchered cows. What was weird was that the truck seemed to never fill up. It always had more space, no matter how much he stuffed into it. I leaned in closer to the screen to figure out how that was possible. That's when I noticed him. There was someone sitting in the back of the truck. He was sitting up straight, his back all stiff. His eyes glowed faintly in the footage. The whole time Earl worked, he just sat there. He only moved once. At 4:16 a.m., he turned his head and looked directly at the camera. I decided to go see Earl the next morning. He was by the barn, already working on the truck when I got there. I noticed that the thing looked even shinier than usual. Paint so bright that it glowed in the sun. I tried to peek into the barn to see if I could spot anything unusual, but Earl quickly stepped in front of me to block my view. He looked more serious than I'd ever seen him before.
Freddie, listen, my cows are sick. It's a bad infection. And I don't want you going near the barn. It's not safe,
He said. I'd never heard of cows getting that sick before, and it made me even more curious. But then I noticed just how obsessed Earl seemed with the truck. He was wiping it down with a rag, treating every inch like it was precious. I circled around it, and I noticed the thick yellow liquid dribbling out of the exhaust. I'd never seen anything like it before in a car. I moved to touch it, when I suddenly heard Earl shout to get away. I jumped back, startled. Earl had never raised his voice at me before. His face was red, and his eyes were wide. I'm sorry, Earl, I said. But he just kept staring at me, breathing hard. I have never heard him so angry in my entire life. I turned and I ran all the way home. I spent the rest of the day in the house. Every now and then, I'd look out across the road, and every time I did, that truck had moved closer. The first time I glanced over, I was surprised to see that it was pointed straight at my house. Its headlights seemed to shine like a pair of eyes. Earl was far off in a field. By lunchtime, it was halfway down the driveway. Behind it was a trail of that weird yellow fluid. Earl was still in his fields. By the time my parents came home, the truck was gleaming by the side of the road. It was close enough that I could see its grills were coated in the fluid. As my mom started on dinner, I watched Earl get into that truck and drive it back to the barn. And then he got out and put a tow rope on the truck. He tied the other end to a nearby tree. It sat there the rest of the evening, all chained up, like a hungry animal, I thought. I waited until evening before setting up my camera again. This time, I focused it directly on Earl's farm, but something was different that night. Earl didn't go into the barn. Instead, he just drove the truck out and left. It was a dark night, and I struggled to see, but the night vision camera made things a little clearer. Through the greenish screen, I could make out the same figure of a man sitting in the back of Earl's truck. The figure didn't move at all like last time, except for when Earl got to the end of his driveway. Before he was supposed to turn into the road leading into town, the figure raised its head, and it looked right at the camera. The glow of its eyes reminded me of an animal. They didn't blink at all. They just stared right at me, even as Earl turned the truck into the road. And it kept doing that. The rest of its body never moved an inch, but its head, it twisted backwards to keep its eyes on me as Earl drove away. I tried my best to stay awake until Earl came back, but staying up the past few nights had finally caught up to me. I couldn't help nodding off. So I decided to keep the camera going and check the footage in the morning. As soon as I woke up, I checked the camera again. The night vision footage showed Earl didn't get back until around 3 a.m. The truck rolled slowly into view, but this time, there was definitely something in the back. It was large and covered with a sheet. It was impossible to see what it was from my angle. But what really caught my eye was the man. He was now sitting on the roof of the cab. The figure stared at the covered thing in the back of the truck. Earl continued driving. It was as if he didn't notice the man sitting there at all. As the truck passed by my house, the figure turned to look at me. Then, suddenly, the footage glitched. The screen filled with static, and it stayed like that until the recording ended. I glanced across to Earl's place, and I spotted his truck parked out front. The bed was empty now, but there was a slick of thick, lumpy liquid staining the ground underneath it. It looked like pus, I thought. Earl was under the truck like he didn't mind it. He was busy working on it like he always did. Normally, I'd be right over there with him, handing him tools and chatting. But something held me back today. I made up my mind then, deciding to stay up again that night. I needed to see what Earl was up to when he thought nobody was watching. That night, I was determined to find out what was going on. I set up my camera in my room like I always did, but this time, I decided to hide out in our garden. I made my way over to Earl's farm as soon as I saw the truck drive away. It'd been a good while since it'd been that close. The air around the farm was thick with the smell of diesel and motor oil. It was a stark difference from what it usually smelled like. I tried to get into the barn, but I found that the big old door locked tight. Now that I thought about it, I hadn't seen any of Earl's cows the past few days either. I walked around the barn, searching for another entrance. All the windows were boarded up. The familiar soft smell of feed and cow manure was now gone. Now, there was only the harsh chemical scent of motor oil. I had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do, so I found a clump of bushes near Earl's driveway, and I decided to hunker down there for the rest of the night. I nestled into the bushes and made sure I was well hidden. I checked my watch, deciding I would wait for Earl no matter how long it took. The night was quiet, just the distant sounds of the countryside and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I must have fallen asleep, but the sound of Earl's truck rumbling into the driveway snapped me awake. I watched quietly as he parked right in front of the barn. This time, there wasn't anyone with him, but there was something in the back. Earl got out of the truck and walked around to the back. He opened it up and started dragging out the thing covered in sheets. It landed on the ground with a loud thump, and I saw a dark stain on the sheets. Earl didn't waste any time. He dragged it over to the cab of the truck. Something hard fell on the ground as he was working. I stayed hidden, and I watched as Earl shoved the rest of the object in, then slammed the door shut. He headed straight into his house after that, leaving the truck sitting there. It hummed like it was still running. I crept my way towards the truck as soon as I knew the coast was clear. I wanted to see what had fallen on the ground earlier. And my stomach dropped as I reached the spot and saw it. It was an old tennis shoe. I recognized it immediately. I'd learned to watch out for it in the school bathrooms. I had seen that shoe fly towards my face and step on my fingers 100 times by now. It was Lester's shoe, the guy that always bullied me. At that second, I didn't even think. I ran home and I didn't look back. I steered clear of Earl after that. The summer quickly came to an end, and I was back in school, trying to focus on normal kid stuff. But things in town took a turn when Lester was reported missing. The whole town was shaken up. There were search parties, missing posters, and even a billboard asking for him to come home. Lester was never found. Some nights, I'd wake up to the sound of Earl's truck rumbling in the darkness. The smell of motor oil and diesel would drift into my room. On those nights, I always had nightmares. I dreamed that a man with glowing green eyes would be sitting on my chest. He stared down at me, and he made it hard to breathe. During the day, Earl kept that truck tied up, and the whole time, it'll leak that awful, sick yellow liquid. Then, in October of that year, everything changed for my family. My dad got laid off from the plant, and my parents split up soon after. One morning a week before school, my mom told me they were getting a divorce. She said we'd be packing while Dad stayed at a hotel. Then, we'd move to her hometown to live with her sister until we found our own place. My mom used to be a nurse before I was born. She planned to find a job and a new home for us. The evening before we left, my dad came over in his car and he took me to Dairy Queen. He sped up a few times, which always made me smile, but it didn't feel like a bonding moment between father and son. I think my dad saw that last outing as something he had to do, like checking off a box on a to-do list. But that had always been how he treated his time with me. Most kids my age might have been sad about leaving their dad and not seeing him much after. But honestly, I wasn't too bothered. To me, my dad was just the guy who paid the bills. And to him, I was just my mom's kid. And despite talking about coming to visit around Christmas and during the following summers, I knew when he dropped me off back at home, it would be the last time I would ever see him. We ended up in South Carolina, where my mom's family lived. And that's where I grew up. Life moved on. I went to college in Columbia, met a girl I liked, married her. We traveled before settling down and having our son, Adam. I got a bachelor's degree in business and an MBA, and then I worked in finance. Later, I used my savings to start a classic car restoration business. Over the years, I had practiced those skills Earl taught me, and I put together several award-winning cars, actually. My business did well from the start. It allowed me time to spend with my wife and son. And then an attorney in Bowling Green, Kentucky called me. My dad had passed away at 86 and left everything to me. Dad and I hadn't seen each other since that Dairy Queen visit. Since then, we only talked about once a year, but it was still up to me to tie up any loose ends. I figured I'd spend a few weeks handling my dad's matters and getting the house ready to sell. When I got to Sandfield, I thought things might look different, but I wasn't sure if my memories were just blurry or if the town hadn't changed much. There were a few new buildings and a shopping center. That was about it. Everything else was the same as it ever was, down to the graffiti in the back alleys. The house didn't change much either. Dad even left my room alone. I'm not really sure how I felt about that, but it did make things easier to sort through. I slept in my old bedroom that first night back. It was weird how little it had changed. It was the same old posters on the walls, same creaky bed. It felt like stepping back into my childhood. But that night, something pulled me out of a deep sleep. It was a car driving past. That's when I remembered Earl. I scrambled out of bed and I rushed to the window. I was just in time for me to catch a glimpse of that old truck heading out. It looked just like it used to. It was the same paint that shined like it was brand new. But I knew it couldn't have been Earl driving. The man was pushing 80 when I was just a kid, and it had been over 20 years since then. I watched the truck disappear into the night, and it felt like no time had passed at all since my childhood. The next morning, I decided to walk over to Earl's farm. The place looked a bit more run down than I remembered, like everything else around here. But sitting in front of the barn was the Ford pickup, still shiny and new as if time hadn't touched it. As I got closer, the familiar smell of diesel and motor oil hit me. It brought back a flood of memories. I knocked on the door, expecting that no one would answer me. But when the door creaked open, there stood Earl. He looked exactly the same as he did 20 years ago. Hadn't aged a day, but his eyes looked tired. He was standoffish at first, told me I had no business being around here. But then his expression softened when he recognized me.
Freddy?
He asked. He sounded completely surprised. Yeah, it's me, Earl. Is that really you? I asked, still in disbelief. He just nodded, his eyes moving nervously. Before he could say anything else, I felt pulled towards the truck. I sprinted over and I laid my hand on it. It was warm, as if it had been running recently. Earl started shouting at me to get away from it, but it was too late. The truck's door suddenly unlocked by itself and swung open. Inside, everything was perfect, as good as new, and it even still had that new car smell. But beneath that fresh scent, there was something else, a hint of something rotten. But the seats, they looked incredibly soft. They were this deep, rich leather. The dashboard was polished to a high shine, and the steering wheel looked like it had never been touched. A blast of cold air from the AC hit my face as I leaned in. It felt so good, almost like it was wiping the sweat off my nose. Then, softly at first, music began playing from the radio. It was an old lullaby, the same one my mom used to hum when I was just a little boy. Just as I was about to climb into the truck, Earl tackled me to the ground. He was surprisingly strong for a man who should be well over 100 by now. With a swift movement of his foot, he slammed the truck's door shut. The music immediately faded away, and the engine died out. I was on the ground, rubbing my head. I felt a bruise forming. What the hell was that? What's the deal with the truck, Earl? I asked him. After a deep sigh, Earl finally started to explain. He admitted to making a deal long ago with someone named Mr. Darling. As long as he kept the truck running and well fed, he'd continue to live. Earl thought all it would take were some cattle now and then.
To be honest with you, son, I didn't take him seriously on that deal. I just wanted the truck, and the man was giving it away for nothing. When he said he just wanted someone to take care of it, well, I couldn't resist. We shook on it, and that was that,
Earl said. And driving that truck for the first time, Earl said he'd never felt younger. It felt like he was 20 again. But the truck started to break down when it wanted food. It'll start with a scratch on the paint or a stain on the seats. And Earl, he'd feel it. His joints would hurt just a bit more that day. Or he'd wake up that morning and everything would go blurry. Earl fed it his entire herd, but it continued to break down.
I meant to go out hunting for deer to feed the truck once all my cows were gone. But one night, everything went wrong,
he explained. He paused, taking a deep breath before going on.
I was driving, and suddenly the headlights started flickering, then turned off completely. That worried me a lot, because it meant the truck was breaking down and needed to be fed soon.
Earl's hands were trembling slightly as he fiddled with an old rag.
I took my eyes off the road just for a second to try and fix the lights, you know. But that's when it happened. A drunk wandered right into the road. I didn't even see him until it was too late.
He told me that he was out one night when he saw a drunk on the road. He swore up and down that he didn't press on the pedal, but the car accelerated anyway. He crashed into him, and he felt the engine purr as if the car was satisfied. He hid the body in the back in his panic, but he found it was gone the next morning, and the car was looking brand new, and he didn't feel sick anymore. Ever since that night, Earl would go out on his drives and find someone. Drifters, petty thieves, local bullies. He would leave them in the cab, and by the next morning, they'd be gone, vanished without a trace. Not even their clothes were left behind. I stood back, staring at Earl in disbelief. I told him he was a crazy old man. This had to be fake, right? But Earl did not look like he was 100 years old. Hell, he looked slightly younger than when I left him. He sighed, and he told me that all the proof I'd need was under the hood. He popped the hood, and reluctantly, I stepped closer. He motioned for me to come over. I leaned in, half expecting to see a normal engine, something that would prove Earl was just pulling my leg. But what I saw made my stomach turn. Under the hood, there was no engine, no pipes, tubes, or anything you'd expect in a normal car. Instead, there was something that might have been a heart. But it was unlike any organ I'd ever seen. It was huge, a grotesque yellow color, and it was pumping a thick black liquid through what looked like veins. The smell of motor oil was overpowering, almost choking me. The heart was connected to the rest of the truck by a sticky black webbing that glistened under the hood light. Underneath all this, there was a faint wheezing sound, like labored breathing, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stepped back, my mind racing to process this. What is this, Earl? Earl patted me on the back.
It's the last truck you'll ever own, Freddy. Just as long as you keep that heart pumping.
I backed away. Earl, what do you mean by you? He sighed.
I'm getting tired of this, Freddy. 100 years is a long time. So I'm offering you a deal.
Earl looked at me and extended his hand. I was horrified. Not because of the offer, but because I was actually considering it. You see, a few weeks back, I found a lump on my neck. After a bunch of tests, the doctors confirmed it was cancer, and it was growing fast. They found tumors all over my stomach. The doctors don't think I have long to live. I thought about my wife and my young son back home, how he would grow up without a dad if I wasn't around. I wanted so badly to be there for him, to be the father my dad never was for me. I wanted to be a good dad, to have kids of my own to love and teach about the world. It tore at my heart, thinking about leaving him alone like that. I looked at the truck. Its door swung open. The motor purred like a kitten. With a nod, I shook Earl's hand. We had a deal.